All right, welcome everyone. Whether you're joining us live or you're listening in on the recording later on, I'd just like to welcome you all here and really glad that you're all here with us today. Before we dive in, I want to start by naming something important. Conversations about identity are rarely neutral. They're personal, sometimes tender, sometimes heavy, sometimes deeply liberating. So let's just start with sharing a few agreements for our time together. This is a space for curiosity over certainty, compassion over judgment, and self trust over fixing. I know that your time is valuable, and I don't take it lightly that you've chosen to spend the next hour or so here with me today. We're going to be exploring how my lived experience as a queer and trans life coach shapes the way I understand identity, build meaningful community, and support people in creating lives that feel honest, aligned, and truly their own. Just going to take care of a little housekeeping first thing. If you're in a quiet place and you want to keep your camera on, you're welcome to. And if not, that's okay too. If you're moving around, turning your camera off helps to keep focus on the content. Make sure that you have a pen and paper handy or some way of taking a few notes. We're going to do some self-reflecting throughout our time together this afternoon. And you may want to come back to what comes up for you later. Just ask that everyone mute yourselves as well so that we don't get distracted by any background noise. I'm going to give you as much value as I possibly can during our time together today. At the end, I'll share how you can connect with me for additional support if this work resonates, and we'll leave space for questions. All right, sounds good. All right. Before we go any further, I want to invite us to arrive, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. If it feels okay, and don't worry if you're not able to, just put both feet on the floor, let your shoulders drop, unclench your jaw, and take a slow breath in through your nose and a longer breath out through your mouth. You don't need to fix anything. You don't need to understand everything. Just notice that you're here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dean Rasmussen. I'm a life coach, a trans man, a parent, a partner to my partners, and someone who's lived much of my life outside of traditional norms. My lived experience gives me a particular lens, one that blends identity, psychology, compassion, and lived truth. I coach queer and trans folks, yes, and I also work with allies and anyone who wants to build a life that actually feels like their own. I want to share a little backstory about how this workshop came to be. I was having coffee recently with a mentor of mine, and she made a simple but profound statement. Not all gay people are queer. I immediately agreed with her and understood what she was getting at. And at the same time, I knew I wanted to dig deeper into this idea of what it means to be queer. I knew that I could use my understanding of queerness and my lived experiences of existing outside the norm to impact the way I coach my clients, as well as pass this knowledge on to others, regardless of their gender, their sexuality, or their relationship with queerness. Many people, queer or not, have learned how to shrink, hide, or contort parts of themselves just to survive. Identity, community, and liberation aren't niche topics. They shape how we understand ourselves and how we build relationships and how we move through the world. And who we love or who we're attracted to is only one small piece of that story. If you feel comfortable, take a moment to check in with yourself. Then drop one word into the chat that captures what you're hoping to get from our time together today. I want to share a bit of context for why I do this work, not necessarily as a coming out story, but as a grounding story about identity, visibility, and how we learn to live honestly in a world that often tells us who we're supposed to be. I grew up without language for queerness or transness. For decades, I moved through the world as someone that I had learned to be rather than someone that I knew I was. I adapted early, not because it felt good, but because survival demanded it. I became skilled at managing the tension between the external appearance and the internal truth. From the outside, it worked. I built a life that looked like success, marriage, parenting, responsibility. For a long time, I told myself that meant that it was working. But internally, something always felt misaligned. I could articulate the pieces of my life, but not the whole of who I was. When I came out and transitioned later in life, it wasn't exactly a lightning bolt moment. It wasn't this sudden discovery of a secret that I had been hiding. It was more like a series of small truths that quietly became too loud to ignore. The ways that I felt unseen, even in spaces where I was seen. The ways that my gender and sexuality were assumed rather than understood. And the deep internal work that it took to learn to be me instead of appear acceptable to others. In many moments growing up, invisibility was my goal. Blending in felt safe, but later I realized that true visibility, being seen for who I actually am, isn't about performance or conformity. It's about honesty and presence. Even then, when the world doesn't have language for your experience, this insight didn't just shape my life, it became the foundation of how I work with others. What coming out later in life taught me is this: identity isn't something that you just discover once, it's something that you practice over time. It's something you build courage to show up in, sometimes in tiny moments, sometimes in big ones, again and again. With each step of my transition, each time I choose honesty over safety, I learned more about who I truly am and what it means to live with integrity. And that has changed the way that I show up in life, in my relationships, in community, in absolutely in my coaching. Whether you're here live or you're watching the replay, I want to welcome you to give yourself the time to take some notes during our reflection times. I want you to take a breath here and ask yourself quietly, where in your life have you outgrown an old version of yourself but stayed anyway? You can go ahead and just take some time to write down a few notes for yourself here. This brings us to our first truth. The first thing that I wish more people understood earlier in their lives. People often think that identity is a label that you claim once, but the truth is, identity is a relationship that you build over time. When we talk about identity, we often jump straight to labels: queer, trans, straight, ally, but also mom, dad, parent, partner, wife, husband, CEO, manager, doctor, teacher. The list of identity labels honestly is endless. And labels matter. They give us language, they offer relief. Sometimes they're the place that we most understand who we are and how we exist in the world. But labels are not the whole story. Identity is the ongoing relationship that you have with yourself. It's not just your label, it's not just your role. It includes your values, your history, your resilience, your nervous system, and the parts of you that learned how to stay safe in the world that you grew up in. Most of us were given very narrow definitions of who we're supposed to be. Those definitions came from family systems, culture, religion, gender roles, and survival strategies. Often, we don't consciously choose those identities. We inhabit them because they're rewarded, expected, and necessary. For me, one of the most complex parts of coming out and transitioning later in life wasn't just about my gender, it was about my identity as a mom. Motherhood had been my entire center of gravity for almost 2 decades. It shaped how I was seen, how I measured my worth, how I understood my purpose. Being a good mom wasn't just something I did, it was who I was. And when I started to name my truth as a trans man, I wasn't just afraid of losing acceptance, I was afraid of losing myself. I wrestled with questions like, if I let go of this version of me, who am I without it? What happens when the role that held everything together starts to change? There was grief there, real grief. Not because motherhood wasn't meaningful, but because I had been holding it as my only identity. Coming out and transitioning later in life forced me to question everything, not just my gender, but the roles that I had wrapped my safety, belonging, and my worth around. And this isn't unique to queer and trans people. People who live outside the norm or who feel misaligned inside their own lives often learn early how to question default settings. And while that questioning can be painful, it becomes a skill. That skill builds emotional intelligence, it builds self-trust, it builds the capacity to sit with comfort without abandoning yourself. So if you're here today wondering whether it's too late for change, too late to name something new, too late to let go of a role that no longer fits, you're not late, you're not behind, you're right on time for your life. I want to invite you to take a few minutes to write the answers to these questions down and the thoughts and feelings that are coming up for you right now. Who were you taught to be? Who are you becoming now? And what parts of you are asking for more space, even if that feels scary? This is exactly the work that I do in coaching, not rushing people into answers, not pushing them to abandon what matters, but creating space to understand identity as something alive, something that evolves just as we do. Liberation begins when identity becomes self-understanding, not a role that you perform to stay safe. A lot of us were taught explicitly or implicitly that real community requires compromise. But the truth is, when belonging requires you to abandon yourself, what you're actually losing isn't community, it's you. Community isn't just who we spend our time with, it's who we feel safe with, it's who we're brave with, it's who we become around others. Community shapes our nervous systems, it teaches us what's allowed, what's rewarded, and what parts of ourselves need to stay hidden in order to belong. I show up differently with different people in my life. I notice this most clearly with my three youngest kids. With them, I'm much softer, I'm more playful. I don't feel the need to perform, at least not in the way that we usually mean that. Sometimes I do perform with them, like when I sing or dance in front of them. I'm not good at those things either. I'm off key, I have no rhythm, but it doesn't matter to them at all. They just love it when I'm totally silly. I don't have to explain myself to them. I don't have to justify who I am. I just get to be me. That taught me something really important, that the right relationships don't require armor. That understanding did not come easily for me. In my 20s, I found community in the church. I found connection, structure, belonging, people who cared about me. And like many people who've spent their lives feeling different, that community mattered deeply to me. It felt like safety. It felt like I finally found home. But over time, it became clear that my belonging there was conditional. To stay welcome, to stay loved, to stay included, I had to be fixed. I had to change who I was. I had to believe that something about the core of me was wrong. So I put myself through conversion therapy. Now, I want to be really clear about this. That choice did not come from self hatred, it came from a deep human need for connection. When belonging is on the line, many of us will do extraordinary things to survive. That experience taught me something essential about community, something I see again and again and again in my coaching work. Many queer and trans folks build chosen family, and so does anyone who grows up feeling different, misunderstood, or out of place. But we also inherit patterns from early communities that we may need to unlearn. Patterns such as people pleasing, weak or porous boundaries, staying small in order to stay safe, overextending to avoid rejection. Those patterns don't mean that we're broken, they mean that we adapted. Sometimes the grief of losing community is actually the grief of no longer abandoning yourself. What we're grieving isn't just the people or the rituals or the sense of belonging. We're also grieving the realization that staying required us to shrink, silence, or reshape parts of who we were. So the grief comes from two places at once: the real loss of connection and safety as we knew it, and the tender, complicated sadness of recognizing how much of ourselves we gave up in order to stay. This is a good moment for us to take a pause, take a breath, notice your body. If anything feels tight, see if it can soften just a little. You're allowed to take this all at your own pace. I want to invite you to gently check in with yourself. We're going to do another reflection. Who are you most yourself with? And where do you feel the need to shrink, edit, or explain in order to belong? I want you to take some time and write down what's coming up for you about these questions now. In coaching, this is the work that we do together. We explore how you learn to belong, what patterns kept you safe once, but may be costing you now, and how to build relationships and community that support you instead of drain you. Liberating community doesn't ask you to disappear in order to belong. When we start questioning identity and community, we eventually arrive at the third truth. Many of us believe that liberation comes after we get permission from our families, permission from our communities, our institutions, even permission from ourselves. But the truth is, liberation isn't something you arrive at, it's something that you practice daily, often long before the world catches up. We often think liberation is something external, something that happens after coming out, after transitioning, after leaving a relationship, after finding the right words, after being validated by the world. But the truth is that liberation isn't an arrival, it's not a finish line, it's an everyday practice. Liberation is deeply personal. It's the ongoing process of unlearning what doesn't fit and choosing what does. And that process doesn't happen once, it happens over and over again in small moments, in everyday decisions, in how we relate to ourselves when no one else is watching. As a queer person, and especially as a trans man, my existence is inherently political. Not because I set out to make a statement, but because queerness, by its nature, questions systems. It questions the idea that there's only one way to love, that there's only one way to live, that there's only one way to define family, success, gender, or even purpose. When you're queer, you don't get to move through the world on autopilot. You're forced again and again to ask, why is it done this way? Who does this serve? Does this actually fit me? That questioning doesn't stop with sexuality or gender. It extends into absolutely everything: work, relationships, parenting, faith, success, productivity, our worth. And once you've learned how to question one system, you start to see them everywhere. This is why queerness offers wisdom far beyond identity. It teaches us how to notice when we are living someone else's blueprint. For me, liberation as a trans man isn't about being validated by the world. It's not about approval or comfort or even being understood by everyone. It's about being at home with myself. It's about no longer outsourcing my worth to systems that were never built with me in mind. So, in real life, liberation often looks like this: trusting yourself, even when it disappoints others, setting boundaries without over explaining yourself, releasing shame that was never yours to carry, letting go of roles that once kept you safe but now keep you small, choosing your own path, even when there's no clear roadmap. And none of this is neat, none of it is linear, and none of it requires perfection. I want you to ask yourself quietly, what am I still waiting for permission to do? And where am I betraying myself just to stay comfortable? You don't need to be fearless to be free. You just need to be honest. Honest about what fits, honest about what doesn't, and honest about what you're no longer willing to carry. This is why liberation works so well in a coaching container. Coaching supports this as a practice, not a performance. It helps you notice the beliefs you've inherited, the systems you've internalized, and the places where you're living on autopilot. And then gently and intentionally choosing differently. Liberation isn't about burning everything down. It's about building a life that actually belongs to you. A lot of people are waiting to feel free before they live differently. But what I've learned is that living differently is often what creates the freedom. If it feels okay, I want to invite you into a brief visualization. Close your eyes if that's comfortable, or soften your gaze. Imagine a version of you who no longer needs permission to live honestly. Notice how they move through the world, how they make decisions, how they relate to themselves, and how they relate to others. You don't need the details, just notice the feeling of being at home in yourself. Now, when you're ready, I want you to write down the answer to the following question. What is one small way you could practice that version of yourself this week? Let's bring this all together now. Identity shapes how we understand ourselves. Community shapes how we relate to others. And liberation shapes how we show up in the world. These aren't just queer truths, these are human truths. If something stirred for you today, curiosity, grief, relief, longing, that's information. If you're ready to stop performing and start living, if you want support building a life that actually fits, this is the work that I do as a life coach. I offer one on one life coaching for queer, trans, questioning folks, allies, anyone who wants clarity, alignment, and authenticity. You can feel free to scan the code if you'd like to connect further. You deserve a life that feels like yours, not the one that you were told to live, and you don't have to figure it out alone. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now, and we can just open up for questions or reflections if you'd like.